I found out my sister was getting married from a smiling photograph on my aunt's Instagram, and in that single second, staring at white flowers and twinkling lights and my mother's hand clasped in hers, I understood something brutal. They had not forgotten me. They had erased me on purpose. My name is Naomi Carter, and by the time that photograph found me, I had already spent most of my life learning how to survive being loved only when it was convenient for other people. The post appeared on a hot Los Angeles afternoon while I was half listening to a conference call and sorting through an avalanche of investor notes at my kitchen counter. Aunt Vanessa had tagged half the family, and there was Claire in a white gown, cheeks glowing, fingers curled around a champagne flute, my mother beside her smiling like the proud mother of an only child. The caption was sweet, breathless, celebratory, something about our beautiful bride and counting down the days, and I remember staring at those words for so long that the screen dimmed in my hand. No one had called me. No one had texted. No one had slipped and mentioned a venue or a date or even a man. There was no invitation lost in the mention of venue or a date or even a man. There was no invitation lost in the mail, no misunderstanding, no awkward delay. There was just the clean, deliberate silence of a family that had decided it would be easier if I did not exist inside their happiest moments. The strange thing is, that kind of disappearance does not begin with weddings. It begins in childhood, in small acts so subtle no one else would call them cruelty. I was 10 the first time I realized my mother could look directly at me and still not see me. It was a Sunday morning in Plano, Texas, and Claire had a fever. I was 10 the first time I realized my mother could look directly at me and still not see me. It was a Sunday morning in Plano, Texas, and Claire had a fever. She was curled beneath a quilt on the couch while my mother, Evelyn Carter, pressed a cool cloth to her forehead with the kind of tenderness that made a room feel hushed. I stood in the kitchen doorway holding a charcoal drawing I had worked on all night for a school art contest, my fingers darkened with smudges, my shirt wrinkled from leaning over the desk until midnight. I waited for her to glance up and ask what I had made, or even to notice that I had not slept, but instead she simply said, "Naomi, get your sister some ginger tea, honey?" Or even to notice that I had not slept, but instead she simply said, "Naomi, get your sister some ginger tea, honey," in the same distracted voice she used when asking for a napkin. That was how it always happened. Claire's tears made people gather. My effort made people assign me another task. My father, Richard Carter, was not cruel in the dramatic way people recognize from movies. He was worse in the ordinary way, the kind that hides behind decency and routines. He fixed leaky sinks, read the weather section out loud, took us to breakfast once a month, and let my mother narrate the emotional reality of the house without interruption. When she said, "Claire's always been so delicate," he nodded. When she added, "Naomi can handle herself, she's strong," he nodded again. When she added, "Naomi can handle herself, she's strong," he nodded again, as if strength were a blessing instead of the family's favorite excuse for leaving me alone. By high school, I had learned not to ask for much. I filled out my own scholarship forms. Got my own part-time job at the library, figured out college applications without anyone hovering over my shoulder. Claire, meanwhile, forgot deadlines, panicked over essays, spiraled when she was overwhelmed, and somehow every crisis of hers became a project for me. I once wrote most of her college application while she was at a party, texting me from the back seat of someone else's car that she had forgotten the deadline was that night. She got in. The next week, my mother cried with pride over Claire's future, while my own acceptance to Duke sat on the kitchen table like a receipt no one had asked for. Even after I built a life of my own, the pattern never changed. I moved to Los Angeles after college, built a career in investment strategy, worked impossible hours, bought my own place, and still kept one hand extended toward Texas. I sent Claire money when she needed help breaking a lease. I covered my mother's medical copay when she had surgery. I flew home for Thanksgiving with wine and gifts and the stupid, stubborn hope that maybe this year would feel different. It never did. I was useful, dependable, reliable, the daughter who could be counted on without ever being celebrated. And then, On my 30th birthday, the illusion finally cracked. I had reserved a table for 3 at a small Italian restaurant in West Hollywood and invited my parents a week in advance. My mother had sounded distracted on the phone, said something vague about my father maybe having an appointment, and promised to let me know. That was the night something in me went quiet in a new way. Not broken, not even heartbroken, just finished. So when Aunt Vanessa's wedding photo appeared months later, it did not destroy me the way it once would have. It clarified me. I texted my mother. I just saw the post. Claire's getting married? No reply. I sent another message asking, when were you going to tell me? I watched the little typing bubbles appear, then vanish. A few seconds later, I discovered Claire had blocked me. I stood at my window looking out over La Cienega traffic and felt the truth settle with terrifying calm. This was not forgetfulness, and it was not family chaos. It was a choice, and now, maybe for the first time in my life, I was going to make one too. The first person I told was Serena Vale, because Serena had the rare talent of hearing a painful story and responding not with pity, but with clarity sharp enough to cut through self-deception. We met that evening in a crowded Korean restaurant where the tables were too close together and the air smelled like grilled garlic and hot steak. She listened without interrupting while I described the Instagram photo, the silence from my mother, the block from Claire, and when I finally finished, she leaned back, lifted her glass, and said with quiet certainty, "This isn't passive-aggressive, Naomi. This is strategic exclusion." I laughed under my breath at the phrasing, but she shook her head and added, "Think about it. You paid for half her life when things fell apart. You showed up for every holiday, every crisis. Now she's marrying into money, into a family that cares about image and status, and you're the inconvenient truth walking around with receipts." I wanted to argue, but Serena had always been the one person who refused to let me soften reality just to protect other people's reputations. She tapped the edge of her phone and said, "Her fiancé's last name is Ashford, right? Old hospitality money. His mother is Victoria Ashford. Trust me, Naomi. Families like that curate their stories. You don't invite the sister who reminds everyone where the real history is buried." Later that night, back in my apartment, I sat on the couch staring at my laptop while Los Angeles traffic hummed outside like distant surf. Adrian Wells had asked me weeks earlier if I wanted to join him on a work trip to New York. At the time, I had shrugged it off, saying I was busy with client presentations and quarterly reviews. Now I opened his calendar invite again and looked at the dates in early July. Claire's wedding would happen that same month. For years, I had measured my schedule around family expectations, around holidays and visits, and the constant quiet obligation to be available. Sitting there in the glow of my living room lamp, I realized something startling. The wedding would happen whether I was wounded by it or not. My presence had never been part of the plan. For the first time, the door they had closed on me didn't feel like a prison. It felt like freedom. I packed the next day without ceremony. A black dress, 2 silk blouses, my favorite blazer, a pair of heels that made me stand taller, my passport tucked into the side pocket of a small suitcase as if it might be needed. When I told Adrian I would join him in New York, he glanced up from his tablet with that calm half-smile of his and said simply, "Good, I was hoping you'd say yes." Adrian had always been like that, steady, patient, observant. Where other people tried to solve my problems or analyze my emotions, he created space for them to breathe. We landed at JFK on a Thursday morning, the city wrapped in early summer humidity, and drove straight into Manhattan where the skyline rose around us like a reminder that reinvention was always possible if you were brave enough to begin again. The Mercer Hotel was quiet and polished, the kind of expensive that whispered instead of shouted. Adrian disappeared into a conference call within minutes of arrival, leaving me to wander down Prince Street alone. I walked through a small bookstore, bought a novel I had no intention of reading, and let myself drift through the shelves while strangers moved around me without recognizing who I was or where I came from. That anonymity felt strangely comforting. In Los Angeles, I was Naomi Carter, the strategist, the woman who negotiated investments and made decisions in rooms full of people who measured power in spreadsheets. In Texas, I was the extra daughter. In New York that afternoon, I was just a woman walking between buildings, breathing in a city that didn't care about my history. That evening, Adrian took me to dinner in Tribeca at a place so quiet, the waiters seemed to glide rather than walk. I wore the black dress from my suitcase and tried to focus on the candlelight and the sound of distant conversations, but he noticed the tension anyway. After a few minutes, he said softly, "You're not really here tonight, are you?" I hesitated, then admitted, "Claire's getting married in July." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "And you just found out." I nodded and explained the Instagram photo, the silence, the block. Adrian listened without interrupting, his attention steady in the way that always made me feel like the most important person in the room. When I finished, he said quietly, "You've spent your whole life proving your value to people who decided not to see it. Maybe it's time to stop auditioning." Later that night, we stood by the hotel window overlooking the city lights. I told him everything I had never said out loud before: the tuition I paid for Claire, the hospital bills, the years of showing up with gifts and patience while pretending it didn't hurt to be overlooked. Adrian took my hand and said something simple that changed the entire shape of my thinking. "You don't need their permission to build a life that honors you." The sentence hung in the air between us like a door opening. After a moment, he added, "I want that kind of life with you, Naomi. One where you never have to shrink just to belong." It wasn't a proposal in the traditional sense. There was no ring, no theatrical gesture, just a quiet question inside his words about whether I wanted to step into a future that wasn't defined by other people's approval. I looked out at the lights of Manhattan and realized that the answer had already been growing inside me for years. I turned back to him and said yes. Something in his expression softened, as if a weight he had been carrying silently had finally lifted. That night, standing in a city that had nothing to do with my family's expectations, I felt a strange, unfamiliar feeling rise in my chest. It wasn't revenge or relief. It was recognition, the quiet understanding that I was finally choosing a life that belonged entirely to me. At 8:15 a.m., while the rest of the floor buzzed with the beginning of another long week, I opened a blank email and typed a subject line: "Leave of absence." For years, I had carried the weight of responsibility like armor, smiling through weekends lost to client meetings and holidays interrupted by emergency calls. For years, I had carried the weight of responsibility like armor, smiling through weekends lost to client meetings and holidays interrupted by emergency calls. Writing the message was strangely easy. I didn't plead for approval or outline a careful timeline. I simply stated that effective immediately, I would be stepping away from my role to pursue independent projects. I thanked them for the opportunity, pressed send, and closed the laptop with a calm I had never felt before. Adrian came home that evening while I was standing in the kitchen, reheating leftover pasta. He set his keys down and said, "Pack light." I looked up, confused, and he flipped his phone around to show a reservation confirmation with an image of white cliffs above impossibly blue water. "Santorini," he explained casually. 10 days, no laptops, no schedules. I laughed in surprise and asked when he had planned it. He shrugged with that quiet confidence of his and said he booked it a few days earlier just in case New York had changed something in me. The truth was it had. The idea of stepping away from everything familiar suddenly felt less like escape and more like breathing. When I told Serena about the trip the next morning at our neighborhood cafe, she nearly knocked over her coffee in excitement. She reached into her oversized tote bag and produced a garment bag with dramatic flair. Inside was a crimson silk dress, cut on a bias so the fabric flowed like liquid light. "You're wearing this on that island," she insisted, refusing to let me argue. "It's not revenge, Naomi, it's presence. Show up so completely that the silence you left behind becomes impossible to ignore." It traced the fabric between my fingers and felt something shift in my chest again, the same quiet certainty that had begun in New York. Maybe Serena was right. Maybe sometimes the boldest statement you could make was simply existing without apology. The flight to Greece was long and dreamlike. Somewhere over the Atlantic, Adrian turned toward me with that thoughtful look he wore when he was building an idea. "You know," he said, "we should make this official." I raised an eyebrow, amused, and asked if this was his version of a proposal. He grinned and replied, "Would you say yes if it was?" I pretended to consider it for a moment before answering, Maybe. He nodded like a man satisfied with a favorable forecast and leaned back in his seat. That was Adrian's style. Never dramatic, never rushed, always certain that the right decisions revealed themselves when people were ready to make them. Santorini felt unreal from the moment we arrived. The island unfolded in white curves and blue shadows, every rooftop glowing under the Mediterranean sun. Our villa perched above the sea with an infinity pool that seemed to dissolve into the horizon. The mornings were slow and golden. We woke with the rustle of linen curtains and the distant call of seabirds, drank coffee on the terrace barefoot, and watched the light shift across the cliffs. For the first time in years, I felt my shoulders relax without effort. Nothing was required of me here. There were no expectations to meet, no roles to perform. On our second evening, Adrian asked if I wanted to take a boat out along the coast. I slipped into the red silk dress Serena had given me and walked onto the terrace where he was waiting. His expression changed the moment he saw me, and he said quietly, "You look like someone who has finally closed a door." The photographer he had arranged met us at the dock, discreet and friendly, following us with a camera while we drifted across the Aegean Sea. I stood at the bow of the boat with the wind tangling my hair, the water stretching endlessly ahead, and for once I felt completely unburdened by the past. Adrian took a photo from behind me without asking. When he showed it to me on his phone, I saw a woman I barely recognized, bare shoulders glowing in the sun, red silk against blue water, posture relaxed and unafraid. On impulse, I opened Instagram and posted the image with a single caption, "Not all families are worth RSVPing for." I didn't tag anyone. I didn't name names. Then I closed the app and slipped the phone back into my bag as if the moment belonged only to the wind and the sea. We spent the rest of the afternoon swimming in a quiet cove and drinking white wine while the cliffs turned honey gold in the setting sun. By the time we returned to the villa, I had almost forgotten about the post entirely. It was only later, when my phone lit up with hundreds of notifications, that I realized the photograph had traveled farther than I ever intended. Friends, acquaintances, even distant relatives had seen it. Somewhere across the ocean, people who had once pretended I didn't exist were now staring at an image they couldn't ignore. I watched the screen fill with messages and felt an unexpected calm settle over me. I hadn't meant to start anything. I had simply stopped hiding. By the time the sun rose over Santorini the next morning, the photograph had traveled through the internet like a quiet spark landing in dry grass. My phone vibrated with notifications while I sat barefoot on the terrace drinking coffee and watching the sky change from pale gray to molten gold. Messages poured in from people I had not spoken to in years, former classmates, cousins, even strangers who had stumbled onto the image. Some simply wrote that I looked happy. Others said they admired the caption. A few admitted they had always wondered why I seemed to disappear from family gatherings. The tone wasn't gossiping curiosity. It felt closer to recognition, as if something long suspected had suddenly been confirmed. Adrian eventually wandered onto the terrace holding a paper bag of pastries from the village bakery and glanced at the glowing screen in my hand. "You started something," he said with an amused smile. I shook my head and replied, "I didn't start anything," he said with an amused smile. I shook my head and replied, "I didn't start anything. I just stopped hiding." What neither of us realized at that moment was that the photograph had already reached someone who did not appreciate surprises. In Dallas, Victoria Ashford was known as the kind of woman who managed reputations with the same discipline she used to run her hotel empire. When her niece forwarded the Santorini image along with the caption and a curious note, "Isn't this Claire Carter's sister?" Victoria read it 3 times before setting her phone down. She did not react emotionally. Women like Victoria read it 3 times before setting her phone down. She did not react emotionally. Women like Victoria rarely did. Instead, she called her assistant at exactly 8:30 a.m. and instructed her to gather every public record available on a woman named Naomi Carter. By mid-afternoon, a folder thick with printed pages landed on her desk. Victoria read it slowly, absorbing the timeline of my life with the careful focus of someone evaluating an investment. Duke University graduate, investment strategist in Los Angeles, conference speaker, property owner, articles quoting my analysis on financial strategy, conference speaker, property owner, articles quoting my analysis on financial strategy. Then she turned to the second file, Claire Carter, Texas State University communications degree. Several internships listed, including one at the Ashford Group itself. Victoria frowned slightly when she noticed something odd in the documents. Claire's resume referenced a transfer from a private liberal arts school in New York called Greystone College. Victoria knew most academic institutions worth mentioning. She had donated buildings to a few of them. Greystone College. Victoria knew most academic institutions worth mentioning. She had donated buildings to a few of them. Greystone College did not exist. The discovery did not provoke anger so much as calculation. That evening she called her son, Graham Ashford, and asked him to stop by the house after work. When he arrived, she handed him the folder without preamble and said calmly, "Tell me what you know about Claire's family." Graham described what Claire had always told him, that her relationship with her older sister was complicated, that Naomi had cut ties years earlier, that the family was small but supportive. Victoria listened quietly, then turned the folder so he could see the records himself. "There is another version of this story," she said. Graham scanned the pages, confusion slowly replacing his easy confidence. "You're telling me she lied about where she studied?" he asked. Victoria folded her hands together and replied, "I'm telling you someone in this situation is not being honest. Before you marry into a family, you should know which parts of it are real." While this quiet investigation unfolded thousands of miles away, I was unaware of the ripple spreading outward from a single photograph. That afternoon, Adrian and I sailed again along the cliffs, the water bright and calm beneath us. I felt lighter with every passing hour, as though the years of tension I had carried were dissolving into the wind. When we returned to the villa that evening, my phone buzzed with another message, this time from a college acquaintance of Claire's named Brooke. The text was short but revealing. "She's freaking out. I don't think you realize what your post started." I stared at the words for a moment before placing the phone down. Adrian noticed my expression and asked if something was wrong. I shrugged and told him it was just family noise. In truth, I didn't feel the urge to chase it. For the first time in my life, the chaos back home did not demand my participation. The next morning brought more messages, many from relatives who had never spoken about the tension between Claire and me but clearly understood it now. My cousin Rachel wrote, "I had no idea they didn't invite you. That's awful." An uncle texted, "You always carried more than your share in that family." I read each message slowly, absorbing the strange shift in perspective. For years, my silence had allowed everyone to maintain the illusion that everything was normal. Now that illusion was cracking, and people seemed uncertain whether to apologize or simply acknowledge the truth. Later that evening, another message arrived, this one from a younger cousin who still lived in Texas. He wrote that Claire was spiraling and believed I had deliberately tried to sabotage her wedding. The accusation would have once sent me into a panic of guilt and self-doubt. Instead, I felt something close to disbelief. All I had done was exist publicly for the first time in years. The idea that my happiness could dismantle someone else's carefully constructed story said more about the fragility of that story than it did about me. Meanwhile, in a quiet chapel outside Nashville where Claire's wedding had been planned, the ripple finally reached its center. Victoria Ashford arrived early that morning wearing a tailored navy suit and the expression of someone who had already made her decision. She spoke briefly with the event coordinator and issued a single instruction: scale the celebration down to the ceremony only. The elaborate reception, the 6-tier cake, the string quartet, the lavish floral wall, all of it was canceled before noon. Guests received polite emails explaining that logistics had changed. Inside the bridal suite, Claire sat frozen in her chair while stylists finished pinning her hair, her phone lighting up with confused messages she could not answer. When the planner explained that the reception had been withdrawn at Victoria's request, Claire whispered in disbelief, but she approved everything. The planner simply nodded and said quietly that circumstances had shifted. An hour later, the ceremony took place with barely 20 people in attendance. The chapel was simple and quiet, stripped of the spectacle Claire had imagined for months. Graham stood at the altar looking thoughtful rather than triumphant. Claire walked down the aisle in a dress that suddenly seemed heavier than before, her smile tight with uncertainty. When the vows were exchanged, their voices echoed softly in the nearly empty room. At that exact moment, far across the ocean, I was sitting at a cafe in Oya with a cappuccino in my hand when my phone alerted me to something new. An online magazine called Verb Style had published a summer article about personal reinvention, and my Santorini photograph appeared alongside it with a small credit line beneath the image. Subject Naomi Carter. I stared at the screen for a long moment, realizing the image. Subject Naomi Carter. I stared at the screen for a long moment, realizing the image had traveled even further than I imagined. Somewhere in that chapel in Tennessee, whispers were beginning to spread about the sister no one had invited. The question on everyone's lips was no longer whether I existed. It was why I had been excluded. The chapel emptied quickly after the ceremony ended, leaving behind only the faint smell of flowers and the echo of conversations that had grown strangely cautious. Claire remained in the bridal suite long after most guests had left, still wearing the gown that had once felt like a promise. Her phone kept lighting up with notifications, but she stared at the screen as if the messages belonged to someone else's life. The elaborate reception she had imagined for months, music, speeches, photographs under a canopy of lights, had dissolved in a matter of hours, leaving behind a quiet ceremony and a groom whose expression had grown increasingly unreadable. When Graham offered to drive her home, she shook her head and said she needed a moment alone. What she really needed was time to understand how a single photograph from across the ocean had unraveled the careful story she had been telling. That night, well past midnight in Santorini, my phone rang. The villa was quiet except for the soft rhythm of waves brushing the cliffs below our window. Adrian stirred beside me but didn't wake as I reached across the bed and saw Claire's name glowing on the screen. For a moment I considered ignoring it, letting the call dissolve into voicemail like every other unanswered attempt she had made to reach me in the past. But something inside me had shifted during those days on the island, and curiosity finally won. I could hear the uneven rhythm of her breathing, the kind that comes after hours of crying. Finally, she whispered, "Why did you do this?" Her voice sounded small, stripped of the confidence she had always worn like armor. I asked quietly, "Do what?" She replied with a shaky laugh. "The photo, the caption. You knew people would see it. You knew it would get back to them." I sat up slowly, letting my feet touch the cool tile floor, and said with a calm that surprised even me, "Claire, I posted a picture of myself on a boat. If that destroyed your wedding, the problem started long before that moment." For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she whispered that Victoria Ashford had canceled the reception, that guests had left early, that everything she had planned was gone. "You humiliated me," she said, her voice cracking. I leaned against the window frame and looked out over the dark water before answering. "No, Claire, I lived my life. You're humiliated because the story you told about me finally met the truth." The words were not angry, they were simply honest. She tried to argue that I had always overshadowed her, that people compared us, that she wanted something that belonged only to her. I listened quietly before replying. "I gave you space for years. I gave you money, support, silence, whatever you needed. The one thing I won't give you anymore is my disappearance." Her breathing slowed, and for the first time since the call began, she sounded less defensive and more exhausted. "I didn't want things to end like this between us," she murmured. I thought about that for a moment before saying gently, "Then you shouldn't have erased me." The line went quiet again. Eventually, she asked the question I think she had been holding back from the beginning. "Do you hate me?" I closed my eyes and considered the weight of that word. When I finally answered, my voice felt lighter than I expected. "No, I don't hate you. I just don't feel responsible for you anymore." A soft sob escaped her before the call ended without another word. I stood there for a while listening to the wind outside the villa, realizing that the anger I had once imagined confronting her with had quietly dissolved somewhere along the way. The next morning I woke early and stepped onto the terrace with a cup of coffee. Santorini shimmered in the sunlight, white rooftops catching the morning glow as if the island itself had been rinsed clean overnight. My phone buzzed again with new notifications, messages from friends, comments on the article, strangers thanking me for sharing a story they recognized in their own lives. The attention felt surreal, almost detached from the quiet peace I was experiencing in that moment. Adrian eventually joined me, rubbing sleep from his eyes and asking if I was all right. I told him about the call. He listened carefully, then took my hand and said, "Closure doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's just the moment you realize you don't need to keep fighting." When we returned to Los Angeles a week later, the transition back into my old routines felt surprisingly gentle. Instead of returning to Westmount Capital, I signed a lease on a small office in Culver City and started building something entirely my own. I called it Carter Strategies, a consulting practice focused on helping women launch businesses and navigate financial independence. Within a few weeks, the office filled with the energy of new ideas, entrepreneurs building technology platforms, designers launching clothing lines, nonprofit founders determined to create opportunities for single mothers. Listening to their ambitions reminded me of the years I had spent working quietly behind the scenes for others. This time, however, I wasn't invisible. One afternoon, about a month after the Santorini trip, I received an email that made me pause. The sender was Victoria Ashford. Her message was brief and formal. She would be in Los Angeles the following week and wondered if I would be available for a conversation. No explanation, no apology, just a request. I stared at the email for several minutes before replying with a simple confirmation and a meeting time. When she arrived at my office exactly at 2 p.m., she carried herself with the same calm authority she was known for in business circles. We shook hands and sat across from each other in silence for a moment before she spoke. "I didn't come here to apologize," she said. I nodded and replied, "I didn't expect you to." She placed a printed copy of the Verb-style article on my desk and said thoughtfully, "They described your story as grace redefined. I think they misunderstood. This isn't grace redefined. It's grace reclaimed. It's grace reclaimed. It's grace reclaimed." We talked for nearly an hour about work, strategy, and the idea of building opportunities for women who had been overlooked in traditional business environments. Victoria eventually leaned forward and said she was launching a national initiative called Women Forward and wanted me to design and lead it. The offer surprised me, not because I doubted my abilities, but because it came from someone whose family had become part of my past conflict. I told her honestly that accepting the role would place me back in orbit around people who once erased me. She considered that quietly before replying, "No, it places them in orbit around you." That evening, I accepted the offer and wrote a short blog post about walking away from places that required silence to survive. By morning, the post had been shared thousands of times. Messages arrived from women across the country describing their own stories of being overlooked or dismissed. I read each one carefully, realizing that my experience had become something larger than a family dispute. It had become a reminder that disappearance is sometimes a choice imposed on us, and that reclaiming our presence can change more lives than we expect. Several days later, a new message appeared on my phone. It was from Claire. There was no greeting, no explanation, only a photograph of a newborn baby wrapped in hospital blankets. Beneath the picture, she had typed a single sentence, "Do you want to meet your niece?" I stared at the tiny face on the screen, noticing the delicate fingers curled against the blanket, and felt the faint pull of the past trying to tug me backward again. For a long moment, I considered replying. Then I turned the phone off and set it aside. Some doors, once closed, do not need to be reopened to prove that you have moved forward. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt overlooked or erased in your own life, share your thoughts in the comments and let others know they're not alone. Like this video if it spoke to you, and subscribe for more stories about resilience, identity, and quiet strength. Sometimes the loudest comeback isn't revenge or confrontation. Sometimes it's simply choosing yourself and walking forward without apology.